Welcome back. I had a lot of people come up to me during the interval and say, you know, what a great panel. We're really getting a very good story out of all of this. So I'm delighted, and I'm sure that the panel will also be delighted. But one of the things that you're also getting is that this is a path that has its own dynamics, and that once you start, as Brian said, things do get easier. People get into the habit of doing this, and their internal synergies appear. Also external synergies of the kind that Don was talking about in his relationships with the oil sands new users of Edmonton water, and Hilmy talking about, you know, it builds and builds, but you also should be getting the idea that it isn't a clear path. And you had two examples of the economics can turn against you, regulation can turn against you. Another one is financing. Because what we're talking about in a world in which sustainability has much, much more in the way of reporting requirements and much more in the way of creating baselines, which is not cheap. The research that is required to dig into the data to create baselines, and then to the employment or the diversion or the creation of resources in order to actually track movement away from those baselines is not negligible. And this is one of the reasons we wanted Usha Rao Manori to be with us this morning. She works with IFC, which is the business financing arm of the World Bank Group. The IFC only lends to businesses, and one of the things that they have done in the very recent past is to take a look at their own operations and ask themselves the extent to which they were actually financing the brave new world of sustainable investment, which includes a number of the things that we have been talking about this morning. Frankly, not as well done as what you've heard about this morning, but at least trying to get people on the path. And I just wanted to read you the IFC investment operation in the utility sectors is what she is working on, focusing on urban infrastructure and natural gas. Her department works with companies and investors on issues of environment, social sustainability, resource efficiency, clean energy, agribusiness, food security, and strengthening of SMEs, supply chains, and communities. So this is an indication that the world's institutions and facilities are also setting up and listening to the need that these companies have identified, so that as companies move into overseas operations, there starts to be financing available that will at least offer some cover, repayable obviously, because it is an investment for these types of operations. So I wish she had been here, because she could have talked about this with a great deal of vividness and vibrancy. But you should know that this is not something, I'm sure you realize that this is not something that is just going on in Canada. A couple of our panelists talked about the homologue activities in the United States, but it's also being demanded in terms of international investment. Wastewater treatment plants, for example, you know, the bar has been raised. No government went around and raised the bar, but it's simply that nobody would now, no country, no utility would start thinking about building a wastewater treatment plant without asking themselves if they were going to be able to capture the heat, what the possible energy return was, where there was a potential for actually creating nutrient product, you know, whether the water would be in a fit state for onward sale, whether you could add to the revenue stream with the water. And these are not questions we asked about wastewater treatment. We used to say, please just take it as far away as you can, don't talk about it, and do something to it, and don't bother me with it. And the paradigm is absolutely changing on wastewater plants, and somebody needs to finance and help with those changes. So there, that's my 2 minutes in loyalty to Ushi, who couldn't be here, but it's an important consideration. So we've got the luxury of a good amount of time to talk about the issues that were raised this morning. Is it possible to have the house lights up just a little bit more, please? Because I can't even see where the microphones are. But I would ask that we do the same thing that we did yesterday, with people go and line up behind the microphones. And as soon as I find out where they are, I'll start identifying people in the lineup behind them. I know Jack wanted to kick off, Jack Hull from Victoria. Are you up there? Okay. who runs the utility in Victoria, and he wanted to question the assumption that the corporatized form was an essential, even though an often helpful, means of getting to the place that we have to get to.
Thank you. Jack Hall, I'm actually currently our project director for our sewage treatment project in Victoria. But up until last August, I was general manager of Integrated Water Services, which provided water and wastewater services to the capital region in Victoria. And yes, I did want to challenge the premise that the EPCOR model good, municipal model bad, and there was sort of nothing in between. That's the impression I was left with this morning. And I just highlight some of the success we've had in Greater Victoria, and perhaps as implementing some of the measures that have been implemented by Edmonton and EPCOR. We have no infrastructure deficit in the Greater Victoria water supply system. It was eliminated over a 15-year period. Like a lot of municipalities, we started off in the early 90s with underinvestment. If it breaks, we'll fix it, but we won't be proactive. We put a strategic plan in place that addressed our water supply, our water quality, our infrastructure, and also pricing. And we moved to a utility model for pricing. So our pricing is based on our asset base. And over the next 15 years, with over $200 million in investment, we eliminated the infrastructure deficit and addressed our water quantity issue and our water quality issues. And all the decision making was ultimately done by a group of politicians who recognized that if they didn't invest, there was going to be a major negative impact on the quality of life within the capital region. We also run the distribution system that serves about 60,000 people over 5 municipalities. We recommended a 10-year program to deal with asbestos cement pipes. In our case, you would cast iron. Yep. The politicians came back and said, no, we want to do it in 5 years, and put the money into it. With the utility model, we obviously generate revenues. Every cent of that revenue goes back into our infrastructure to improve the infrastructure and, as I say, to eliminate the deficit. During the same period, particularly in the last 10 years, we've had about 14% growth in population. Our water demand has dropped by 8% during that same period. And for example, in 2001, we had an outdoor ban on outdoor water use for 9 months of the year. Last year, our normal water use was down at that level without anything extraordinary in terms of water restrictions. So I think given probably the right group of politicians and the right group of managers, you can achieve much of what EPCOR has done without going to the full corporatized model and without aggressively going after business in other municipalities. I certainly support the idea of what EPCOR's done with small systems, because that's where the real issue is the resources in small systems are not there to deal with some of the issues, and that's where an organization like EPCOR can provide significant assistance, something that we as a regional government can't do because of our legislation and rules.
Jack, what do you think made the difference? Why was it that in Victoria politicians had or perceived that they had the space to make those decisions, and were willing to face the public, having made decisions to spend more money on water and to ask the public for more money on water? Well,
the first thing, I think the regional government politicians are one step away from the electorate in that they're members of their local councils appointed to the regional board.
Well, you said that they were elected officials that
but
did
they are
all
elected
this.
officials, but at the local level, but appointed to the regional board and appointed to the Water Commission. So they're one step away from being directly elected to the board.
That's the key.
The other thing was a certain amount of luck. In New Year's Eve in 1992, we had a major water main break, a 36-inch water main burst.
Ah, good.
It caused a lot of damage. So when I went to my budget that year, I had all sorts of photographs of all the damage caused by this water main break. The fact that it took 18 hours to shut the water off because the valves hadn't been serviced probably since 1915 when they were installed. And we had air release valves. Well, you couldn't actually recognize them as valves. They were just big clumps of rust. And I asked for some money to do a study on infrastructure, and I think one of the 2 times in the last 20 years, politicians have said to me, "Are you sure you've got enough money in your budget? Would you like some more?"
Good Lord. Well, you didn't tell me you were lucky enough to have a disaster. I mean, that's the...
It really helps. A disaster really helps.
Well,
Okay, thank you. No, the Australians, who had the, thanks very much. And I'm going to ask Don what comments he has on this, but the Australians had 7 years of what they called the big dry, and they actually managed to get a lot of water resource changes in the country. And, they used to start off their presentations by singing, "There is simply nothing like a drought," and because they took advantage of the drought. And I regret to say that in 15 years of taking a hard look at water change around the world, I have seen almost none of it that isn't associated with places hitting the wall. The only 3 cities that ever ran out of water that I know of were all in a rainforest, because then people are even more less aware of the actual need to do something about it. So hitting a wall is unfortunately one of the precursors to change in a lot of places. Don?
There's an expression that goes, "Never waste a crisis."
Yes.
And I think if we go back to breakthroughs in anything from medicine, sports to business, it's those that seize upon hard times and convert them to the strengths, as opposed to retreating or pointing fingers or anywhere else but themselves to the solution. And I strongly and passionately feel that the corporatized commercial model is the absolute right way to go, because it's sustainability over time. And the separation, particularly in the decision-making from an elected representative to a person that is based upon their pursuit of skill, through academia or operations, that is what they do. And I think in your example, Jack, the separation, it was a critical part to make that work from the elected representative, albeit they're elected and appointed to I guess, an oversight body. But, I think at the end of the day, the point is not to quarrel as one or the other better or worse, but rather how do you get the result? And that's what we pursue, is a consistent result. I would be curious, Jack, how have you stepped up, or how do you address the question of wastewater disposal in Victoria?
With great difficulty. We are in the process of putting in sewage treatment, and no doubt we'll hear from EPCOR in the procurement process.
And where did the money come from? I could go down that track. I think the point is that water is a full cycle from potable to waste, and if we really operate at that level, we accept it's our responsibility completely, and we can't just handle part of it and take a blind eye to the other. And I would applaud if you step up and support that and bake that into your rates, so that Victoria becomes a poster child of the way things should be.
Yeah, and I think when you look at how we're going to procure the project, it's a mix of procurement methods, the design build, for example, with the liquids plant, a full P3 for the biosolids processing. So we're taking full advantage of private sector expertise while still addressing some of the political issues that we deal with QP, for example, in terms of maintaining ownership and operational responsibility. As you appreciate, it's a highly political process in BC particularly, Victoria even more so. Yeah. But we're moving ahead.
Yeah, and it's good to see the progress.
I like the innocent tone of Don's question. Yeah. Remind me how it is you deal with waste again.
One of the organizational changes we made a couple of years ago was to integrate the water and wastewater groups, so that we're responsible from source to disposal.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, and good luck, by the way, in going home and facing the music on that. Are you standing behind a microphone? Good. Okay. I told you I couldn't see, so yeah.
I'm Carrie Freak. I'm the editor of Water Canada magazine, and I wanted to look a bit wider than what we've already discussed, like you suggested, Margaret, with my question. Since I heard about the Gold Bar project with Suncor, I've been very interested. It's a really interesting model of collaboration, and I applaud it. It's been a really cool thing to profile in the last few years. One of the greatest advantages of municipalities is that treated effluent is often returned to the source. So But if, if every refinery or industrial operation was going ahead with the method that you two are collaborating upon, then what kind of impact would it have on return flow? At what point do you cap these kinds of partnerships so that you are, in fact, allocating water for nature's needs? Just interested how you're approaching that.
It's a terrific question. So, again, looking at the total flow of a system is absolutely essential. So, the return flow to the river and ensuring that we keep the level at the appropriate level required for sustainable use sort of sets, that's the baseline. We can't fall beneath that. And where I see it going is actually the gold and the value in water is going to be on the waste portion. And when you look at a lot of industries and societies as they move forward, they take the low-hanging fruit, the free food, the clean and the easy harvestable resources, and then it finally gets to the harder and harder level. You go through a cycle where you realize that, if we can harvest all those things which are in the backstream, in the sewage end of it, that's where you really differentiate. That's where you harvest the value that you would otherwise discard. And I think we're just tapping the surface that in Arizona, for example, where we operate there, we have some communities like Anthem where they're 100% recycle. So we have white and purple pipe, and there is no return water. That water is fully used in car washes, in fountains, in irrigation, and then a percent of it injected back into the aquifer. So my dream for the rest of Canada and the rest of the United States would be to eventually go to 100% recycle, and we will be making our gold on the waste, not on the charging on the input side.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, thanks. Help me, you guys, because I can't see.
Here, use your Superman glasses. I don't know if you guys have
I
seen
still
this,
can't see.
or Supergirl glasses.
I swear,
guess.
paper burns when she looks
Yeah.
at it, too.
No.
I was wondering what those were from.
If
up
you
there.
ask the wrong question, laser
That's
beam.
right,
will
laser
shoot
beams
out.
will shoot out at you. Let me
That
see.
was the 20-minute zap.
Yeah. Anyway, you have the microphone.
Sorry. Good
I'm
was this.
Adrian from Pine River Watershed.
Sorry, louder.
I'm Adrian Mason from Pine River Watershed Initiative. And I had a question in regards to the paradigm shift that has been mentioned, and it's not just one thing, but targeting the idea of water as a human right. And does that not create almost a paradox with the idea of privatizing or labeling water as a commodity? So I guess I would address the first question to Margaret, and then a follow-up question would be to either Dawn or Brian. As representatives of large-scale industry with large profit margins and government subsidies, I would ask you, how does your stance and position of privilege compare to the position of the underprivileged or disadvantaged that are already water challenged? And what would your opinion be on reconciling this if water was to be priced?
Okay. So you're saying, is there a consistency with the declaration of water as a human right with the kind of charging that we're talking about? And then secondly, what's a corporate responsibility to the water challenged or to people just where there's a resource insufficiency? Okay, have I got it more or less?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, I'd love to take on the first one because I think that it has been, and my language on this is almost as strong as Dawn's, and he talked about this as a hard-earned right, and I like that formulation. It has been the cruelest of constructs to equate a human right with free water, because of all those that cannot afford free water, the poor are the ones that can least afford the poor are the ones that can least afford free water. Let me tell you why. Because in systems where water is free or charged too little, that are run, particularly those that are run publicly, they respond to those that have the most resources. It simply is, this is the case. In city after city, you can wish that it weren't so. In village after village, when there isn't enough to go around, the systems favor the more powerful people. Mark Twain said, water flows uphill, it moves towards power. And the last person in the irrigation line, the person that's tail end at the irrigation line, the slum dweller, those that depend on water vendors, these are the people who have a theoretical right to water, but because the systems don't work or break down, or the wastewater treatment systems don't work or break down, they are the ones that are in fact underserved or not served. And they're the ones that we include in the billion people that around the world don't have access to clean and safe water. Those people, when they live in areas that charge for water, and where there is a subsidy to them on water, and this is where I think Don was making a blanket case against subsidy. I have a feeling that he meant a subsidy at the company level, because many cities, many areas have a subsidy to the poorest people within the jurisdiction. And this is done in a number of ways. In South Africa, everybody gets a small amount of free water. And then the next tranche of water delivery costs more, the next costs even more, and the swimming pool level, both the rate and the volume go up so that everybody gets some water. In New York, it's done by postal code numbers. In the UK and in France, it's done a different way. In Chile, the poor pay their water bill, but if they are receiving social assistance at the end of the year, they get a heavy percentage of that water bill returned to them. They pay, but they get it back to them. So I applaud those jurisdictions that do have a subsidy for those that can at least afford to pay a water bill, but I fully agree with everybody being charged for water, because that's the only way that you make systems work. There's a right to food. We all pay for food. Some say there's a right to education. We certainly pay for education one way or another, through taxes or through direct school fees. So I think it's been a cruel juxtaposition of issues to say that if it's a right, then it has to be free, because the ones that it has penalized are exactly the 1 billion people that don't have access to clean and reliable water. It's when you've got a system that functions. And in many of the countries where these people live, there is no tax base. And so therefore you cannot decide that it's the tax base that should be paying for these. And the numbers that are involved are so much larger than any development assistance numbers that it would be, it's implausible to have development assistance pay for those numbers. In short, there's either taxes, tariffs, or transfers. That's the only thing that ever paid for water anywhere. So you can charge people in the tariff, you can charge people as taxpayers and then have it put in from the taxation, but then you'll get distortions in favor of certain neighborhoods and away from other, and there's tariffs. And the tariff actually over time as a poverty alleviation and as a fulfillment of rights, I think, does the superior job. So it's a question I like to receive, because I believe it's a cruel linkage to perpetuate that. I think that if you really care about poor people, that you will have a system that charges them slightly for water. And by the way, poor people agree with me. Always, when you go out to villages and you say, if you had reliable systems, would you be willing to pay for it? And they say, yes, absolutely, because they pay now. They're paying vendors now, and they're often paying up to 20% as much as they would be paying if they had a properly functioning system. So it's a good question, but I feel quite passionately about the answer. So let's, Don, over to you. And
you're extremely articulate, and I'll only add to that. I share, I think, your view that people are treated fairly, rightly, and justly, but that water is non-substitutable, and we have to find ways of allocating it. And when we don't charge for water, one person can step up and take all of the water to irrigate a field to grow melons in a desert where they shouldn't be growing. Another will need water to wash its baby. And when we talk about elimination of subsidies, it's a narcotic, and it's a cancerous like narcotic. Subsidies take away from people the will to work, the will to assign value, the will to build value and protect that which they've got and care for it accordingly. So in our rate structures, it's exactly as Margaret says there. We have what's called like a lifeline level, a minimal level, and that ensures that you have enough water within your home, or family to do what you need at that level. But then as you step up, if you have a swimming pool, if you want to have a jungle in your front yard and it's a desert, well, you're going to pay. And we're going to reward customers that conserve. We're going to reward, industries that find ways like Pepsi and Suncor to absolutely wring the towel and make maximum use of every droplet of water that they've got. And you want companies incented to run commercially because companies hire young people, they invest in technology, they provide jobs that allow people to build homes, raise families, go to schools. It promotes the quality of life. And the most thing that you really, really want is companies to be profitable, because profitable companies pay taxes. And our society runs on the payment of taxes, fees, or tariffs. Governments don't pay taxes. In fact, the pensions of every union and every person in this room that's got a pension needs companies that make profits. Profit is a wonderful word. It's not a dirty word. It's not something that you should apologize for, because the profits that companies pay your pensions, they pay the employees, they fund the research, they bring the membranes, they bring the pipes, they bring the donations to those countries and areas that can't afford it. That's why you want companies that are able to do that. We don't have a subsidy. Subsidy's not allowed in our jargon. And you need to, I think when you make broad statements like that, research them carefully, because, I take offense when we're accused of doing something that we don't, because I represent 2,700 people, and we are employees of a city, and we care for those people, and not one of them views themselves as taking a subsidy, because we don't.
The other thing is 96% of water is delivered by public authorities, and my words about the need for them to be to be financially secure and to be able to function financially, it applies absolutely. I'm not making a plea for public or private ownership, because it's just as important that publicly owned utilities and publicly operated utilities be financially soluble, because they can't deliver to people if they're not. What about energy? I mean, everybody needs energy too. How do you, you must get this question a lot in terms of, how does energy reach poor people?
Well, I think the debate on that one is just beginning.
Yeah.
And I think, energy, this is an energy question opposed to a water question,
Yes.
I assume, right? So, energy, the value of energy continues to go up, right? And in order to supply the world, we're going to have to find more sources of energy,
Yep.
To meet this growing world from 7 to 9 billion by 2050. Because a lot of the world really wants what we have, right? Mm-hmm. So, we work with in the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and they've created this position paper or project called Vision 2050, which is really trying to get to 9 billion people living well by 2050. And they've created this whole energy portfolio nexus, really, which is how do we produce energy moving forward that is both affordable, but also meets the requirements of the planet to manage those type of things, right? And, and that pathway is not very easy.
No, because some of it's got to be off-grid.
Off-grid.
Yeah, exactly. So,
and I think two things that we're trying to do, oil sands is kind of right now is the marginal barrel. Mm-hmm. Because it's expensive to produce, but in order to help bring those energy costs down, like we're really focusing on how do we reduce the costs so we can hopefully get transferred some point to the customers as we develop it more effectively and efficiently, as well as other sources of energy like renewables and others, right? Because they're right now subsidized to be put forward. So, we're not out of the woods on that one.
No, that's just starting.
We're just starting.
And, South Africa is one of the first countries, again, to have riots and civil disturbances about the right to free energy. An interesting one. Yeah. A food company. What does a food company do about the human right to food?
Well, let me give you let me switch over from the food company and give you an example from what I've seen in real life in Pakistan. Okay, I grew up in Pakistan, but I still have in-laws and family there. We talked about pricing of water. Pakistan is an agricultural country, but is relatively very water poor on a per capita basis. The price on water is very low. And what has happened is their water infrastructure and the systems are heavily underfunded and completely collapsed.
Yep.
To the point where we get water in our pipes 1 hour a day, sometimes half an hour a day. That's it. That's all the water you get, half an hour. And it used to be a gush, now it's down to a trickle. So people put these pumps to try and accelerate and suck more water out of the pipes. But everybody's got a pump now, so you're back to a trickle. So what has happened is because the price of water is so low, you have these companies that have set up tankers.
Yeah.
They're pulling water off of the main lines, and then they go around neighborhoods selling the same water. Because it was so cheap, they can buy it in bulk, drain the lines, and they go around selling the water. When you talk about water efficiency, who are the most efficient
Yeah.
countries in the world? It's the ones who don't have water. We're not water efficient because we have a lot and it's cheap. Over there, if you make it really cheap or too cheap and you don't fund your infrastructure, you run into a whole other set of issues.
Yeah.
So to your point earlier, I think the true cost of getting the water, managing the water, having sustainable systems that make sure that nature is addressed, that the needs of the local natural habitat is taken care of, that is part of regulation. That's what regulation is supposed to do, is here's the minimum bar, you don't go below it. But then also give incentive to those who are conserving, who are becoming more efficient, switching to PepsiCo as an example. When companies strive for higher efficiency, they strive to demonstrate something new, they strive to demonstrate what could be, there is sometimes a high cost to doing that. It is the cost of being the innovator, and I think you mentioned that earlier as well. But the role of government and legislators, and I'm not a government person, so I'm not the expert, but from my perspective, their role is to set up what's the minimum required and an infrastructure, a regulatory framework that gives industry and people the incentive to change their behavior in a certain direction. If we want to be water efficient, if we want to be innovators in a certain field, then the role of government and regulators is to set up that framework. Federal, provincial, municipal, they've got a lot of challenges to figure out. But if they get that set up, industry responds. If the pricing structure is set up correctly, where the municipalities are funded correctly, where the right rules and regulations are set up, industry responds, you get efficiency. You should end up getting a lower cost of production out of it as well, so that we can, again, be competitive as a nation from an export perspective.
Okay. And sometimes special measures are also needed. Right. Okay, thank you. You're very patient. Who is that?
Rob DeLoe from the University of Waterloo.
I thought it was you, but I can't see that far.
And you've set me up very nicely, Helmi, for the question that I wanted to ask, and that's the issue of full cost pricing. It's something that most people, I think, can get behind, the idea that as a consumer of water, I should be paying a price for the service that I'm consuming that reflects the cost of producing it. That one is generally not the subject of a lot of debate, but I would be interested in hearing the perspective of all three of you, because you offer valuable perspectives on the broader definition of full cost pricing. So Helmi, you almost answered it already, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit. You're a consumer, just like me, except slightly different scale. I eat what you make what I eat, I suppose. Brian, it's in some respects, I don't know what proportion of Suncor's services are on a utility line, but in effect you are self-supplied as well in some of your operations, and so you are also a provider, self-provider. And Don, you are of course the utility. And so one of the challenges with full cost pricing is stretching it to include the cost of protecting the drinking water source, for example. And there's a thread in that debate that suggests that as the consumer of the water, the cost of providing that water should include the cost of the activities that are needed to ensure that the water supply that supplies the utility, for example, is protected. And Helmi, you stretched it all the way up. You took it a step further and pointed to going beyond simply protecting the source from sort of the human health perspective, but also ensuring ecosystem conditions. So the question on the table then is, what are your thoughts on broadening the definition of full cost pricing to include, for example, the kinds of activities we need to protect the sources of drinking water, maintain those ecosystem conditions?
Interesting. Okay, very good. By the way, I wanted to thank the young woman for her question. Thank you very much indeed. Who wants to go first on this?
I fully support your question there. I think it has to be a full recognition of all of the elements that go to having a sustainable water supply. There are limits to water availability. There is only so much water available. and the claims on the water as the world continues to grow and has higher concentrations of urbanization and industrialization, those claims cannot be satisfied by giving it freely and equally to the first come, first serve. So there has to be mechanisms, and that's through regulation and pricing contracts that fairly allocate that and recognize the full costs of it. And I support your comments. That goes to the monitoring of the watersheds. That goes to research to ensure that we have improved technologies, to the infrastructure to deliver it, to the pricing. It should be that full cycle of all of those, including a value placed on the commodity called water itself.
Brian, you're nodding vigorously. Are you?
Well, it's a great question. Back when we created OSLI, the Oil Sands Leadership Initiative, we started to talk about how do we actually make better decisions to drive progress forward in the oil sands industry. We created this project called the True Value of Water. We're now calling it the Valuation of Water. And it's carried over into COSIA. So, we're really working to build, how do we get to what is the underlying cost of water within our operations? Because that will really, start to drive positive change when we look at investment opportunities. And we didn't realize that until we started operating these big tailings ponds and moving water around. We started to say, there's a bigger cost than we know, and if we can reduce that, that'll help us overall be competitive in the world. As well, we wanted, Suncor is also engaged with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, so they have a big project on the valuation of water. So we married those two together, and that's also now building into things like, return to the ecosystem and all those other values of water, and how do we incorporate that to get to, we're going to create a blueprint that each oil sands company can then put in what they think to create their value, looking at all these lenses to drive progress forward on reduction and improve operating costs.
Yep.
We're not about altruism, we're about, making progress and profits to keep our business afloat. So it's a very...
And you remember yesterday, IBM, when they were talking about working out a template, the word I used, not they didn't, but on the costing and the valuing of water. And it's really a perplexing question, and they want to try and work to try and get a model out there that we might use together, because that's also important, because for whether you're a public or a taxation or a regulatory authority, if you think the full cost of water is X and you say no, it isn't even near that, how do you then tax or charge those two differentially? So until we come to some quasi-agreed idea on how you value and cost it and measure it, it's going to be very difficult to approach the costing issue. And I think we all agree that we want, for the economic uses of water, we do want costing and pricing. There's disputes on the personal use of water, but for the economic uses of water, especially the growing melons in a desert business. Yeah, do you want to speak for the melons in the desert?
Well, I used to live in the desert. I was born in Dubai and I ate lots of watermelons, and I feel bad about that. So.
They're good too.
They're very sweet, yes. But, I've already said in principle I'm completely in agreement on the correct costing of water, making sure everything's in balance. So I won't repeat that. I think there's one consideration we have to have as we talk about the costing of water in Canada. We shouldn't look at just Canada by itself. And the reason I speak, and I'm speaking not on behalf of PepsiCo, but on behalf of a food and beverage, a food agricultural sector. Okay, we have very high exports coming out of our agricultural sector in Ontario. Being a food plant, part of a food plant network of, say, 34 plants across North America, maybe 36, and 8 of those are in Canada, the most expensive delivered water of any of our plants in this entire North American network is our plant in Ontario. So as I translate that into the agricultural growers and all the SMEs who are trying to grow and process fruits and vegetables and pack them and export them to the US, I think, boy, they must have a very high cost base. So if we say, okay, as Canada, we're just going to go and we're going to price it differently, and over the next 7 years, your prices are going to triple, we go, okay, great, that's going to manage everything, wonderful, we're hunky-dory. But what we may not understand is how many food and agricultural smaller businesses will be out of business, Not because the pricing is wrong, but because the pricing on the other side of this little line is drastically different.
Exactly.
So it needs to be done, but it cannot be done independently. We have to have this whole conundrum solved. How do we do this without putting ourselves out of business, without penalizing ourselves for doing the right thing? That's why it's not easy. That's why we have smart people like yourselves and others here that are going to answer that for
Well,
us.
that's why I was really glad to hear IBM was at least starting to wade into that pond. New York City, and I think most of you in this room will know this, but it's worth pointing it out, that to avoid having to have really expensive treatment costs on their drinking water, New York City had fenced off, the city fathers went out years ago in the 20s and fenced off a whole huge area of the Catskills, including a whole bunch of lakes and a couple of rivers, and they fenced them all off and kept them from further development so that New York City would have this source of really clean, good tasting water. And over the years they've had to renegotiate that a couple of times because those that live in the Catskills say, look, we don't have waterfront access, we don't have this, because we're protecting the drinking water of New York City. So there, the full costing even goes to including cost of living increases to people whose livelihood has been affected by a lot of rules that were set down in 1928. So,
Well, that's also taken that long-term view,
very long, yes.
and
Yep.
we need more of that.
We need a lot more of it. Okay, I think there's somebody over there.
Yes,
Thank you
hi.
for waiting patiently.
Fine. My name's Reg White in the city of Dawson Creek. I think we're a mighty little community in demonstrating some of this sustainability initiatives, both from carbon and water conservation. We've got a carbon fund and a water fund that's being produced from revenues generated from wastewater recycling for fracking purposes, up to 4,000 cubic meters a day for the industry. So we, as a council in the city, have actually made real strides in dealing with the whole, putting real metrics to the sustainability picture. But when it comes to the watershed piece, which we're also investing in through a position that was created, is still a supplementary cost, and there's a lot that needs to be done in investing in monitoring wells, for example, to actually manage it. So I take your point very confidently that if we can get the pricing right, some portion of that fund needs to go into supporting the watershed activities and the monitoring. One of the challenges we've had 2 droughts and 1 flood in the last 3 years. Serious costs, probably $100 million in the flood case, in dealing with bridges and et cetera. And I'm really wondering about, the communities are now saying, well, maybe we need to get off this source because of the droughts. We're thinking, no, we actually have a sustainable resource. Industry is only taking somewhere less than 1% in terms of surface extractions, actually only paying a tiny fraction of the real cost, 25 cents a cubic meter, when in fact they're a price setter in dealing with private agricultural uses they're buying water for anywhere up to $10 a cubic meter. And it's competing with the whole water management picture. And so we've got a pressure on the community now that says, a consortium that says, well, let's just take water from the next watershed. We're going to magically solve our problems from the Peace River or from the Murray River next door. And so the community is now up against this dilemma where they said, well, we've invested in sustainable water management. We're doing everything we can. And now we've got this pretense that we're into a real crisis in terms of supply. And I'm just very curious about how you feel about this whole idea of looking at large-scale interbasin transfer and where that's going to go. I mean, we know we've had the talks on free trade. Once we turn the tap, and maybe we have to go that way. But is it being examined? And I'm just very curious what some of the people are feeling about it.
What do you do when your improvements drive the cost of your water up, so somebody just puts their pipe down somewhere else?
I don't have a quick answer for it, but rather to maybe just add another log on the dilemma fire here, that I think you should be rewarded for the discipline and the results that you've got, but it also raises the notion of virtual water. We again have this perception that shipping touchable, tastable, real water is bad, but it's okay to raise cattle, it's okay to raise sheep, raise crops, raise and produce electronics and cell phones and then ship them, and they have a water content. So you can ship virtual water through value-added production goods. It gets no opposition, it's applauded.
Yeah.
It's the melon example. but you can't stick a straw across a border or a water basin, because that's not okay. And I don't know the answer to it, but I think it's a real dilemma, and it's like the internet. We now can move data back and forth across borders, and there's no opposition, but you drive your car across the border with a binder full of paper and they will stop you on it. So I think it's a delicious thing that people should be looking at, and how do you, I don't know how you solve that one.
It's very tough. You know, Cancun, if you've ever been to Cancun in Mexico, it's this long kind of island or isthmus, and it's chock full of hotels. And the city authorities decided to put in, because they wanted to make sure that what they were doing to the ocean wasn't quite as bad as what they had been doing, because of course all the pipes were just simply going straight out into the ocean. And so they put in a wastewater and water delivery and wastewater treatment plants, which of course raised the cost of water in Cancun. And so therefore the hotels started simply drilling wells and getting their drinking water out of the water below. You know, what do you do? And the Mexican regulatory authorities are not that strong, and so therefore this was in fact a private company that did this on the assumption that they were going to be able to build the hotels, and the hotels simply said, you know, we didn't ask for improved water, we were perfectly happy dumping our sewer out. You can take our wastewater if you want, but we're not going to pay those bills for drinking water. So what you're talking about is not imaginary. It really happens around the world. When you improve water services and therefore drive up the prices and the costs, people can sometimes find other sources, other rivers. I think there's somebody over there. Anybody else want to take on that one? No. Okay.
Hello. My name is Jamie. I'm from the University of Guelph in OCAD University. This question is specifically for Brian, but open to anyone else. Talking, as this is a conference on changing the paradigm, I think there's maybe a need to move past visions and values and start to look at things like performance standards as a metric for pushing the paradigm, really pushing the paradigm for what a successful design is. And what I mean by that is, for example, if I was to build this building, my performance standard would be to build it without an HVAC system. Or if I was to do mining, it would be to create more biodiversity post-development than pre-development. And Don, you kind of talked about it with 100% recycled water. So I'm just wondering, in your conversation leading up to the next iteration of your values and things like that, what is the conversation on performance standards? Like, how far is Suncor pushing this idea of innovation and the idea of this paradigm?
Good question. I think two things are going to help drive us to get to that different paradigm. One is, you know, the incorporation of the vision, mission, and values. And like I said in my talk today, we're just starting to begin our next set of what I'll call sustainability goals. So, you know, we're going to create in 5 areas, but those aspirations are really going to drive how we move forward on things with respect to the use of water, the disturbance of land. We're going to take on greenhouse gases in this round, how we manage waste, and our air emissions. So that's one part, I think, you know, by creating those aspirational statements that'll start to see how we look and try to drive that change. And we saw positive change based on the last round of goals, but we're going to get a little more aspirational. The second thing, and I talked about it in my discussion today, is the clarification of our technology development and innovation strategy. So, you know, that technology and innovation strategy is really going to be guided by the vision, you know, the new VMV, as well as these aspirational goals that we come up with through these multidisciplinary teams. And that will start to drive that technology to try to find those changes in our process. And they could be biological, they could be just new technology. So, you know, I think we're putting the things in play to really drive that change. And it's really about trying to be competitive in the world as an energy supplier, wherever we try to find it and create that for a better world.
Is there anything specific perhaps on what performance standards you're trying to achieve, other than just saying we're trying to limit this and reduce that?
Well, it's just under development, so I don't know when you say performance standards, do we want to be the lowest carbon intensive crude in the world?
Yeah.
Would that be a performance standard?
Yeah, exactly.
So those are the conversations that are beginning to happen both in COSIA and Suncor, you know, to really define that aspiration. I don't know where they're going to land, but they're happening in real time right now, and I just can't disclose them till it gets corporate approval and those type of things. But I think, you know, creating energy for a better world, you know, it's a big step change for Suncor, you know, to really think about how we view things and try to make things
The
move
better
forward.
world half of the equation, yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you for your question. Yes?
I actually think that gentleman was standing with
Oh, thank you very much. Good.
Capana, if you want to go first, you're quite welcome.
this is your home country. The Canadians are always so nice to Americans. So
We have Alphonse and Gaston here. Yes, okay. All right, Gaston, you first and then Alphonse.
Merci, Michael. I'm just a little concerned here. I understand the nexus we're exploring, water and energy and agriculture. And I understand that we're all concerned about the need to turn this world to sustainability at all levels. Everyone contributing their part and doing what they could and what they can. And that we're all concerned about water. And I do appreciate, for instance, the emergence of new things like Brian, the COSIA, which I think is, you know, that's really collaboration for the good and that. And yet I'm concerned, first of all, that you said, you know, all people want to live like us, and that might be a fair observation.
It's what, said what?
We can't
All
really hear you.
people-
Can't hear you.
Can you
all
get a
people
little
wa-
bit closer to the
Okay.
microphone? Yeah.
You said at one point all people want to live like us, and that might be a fair observation. The eco-footprint analysis of William Rees, Wackernagel, and it's adopted by several UN agencies, that if all people on this earth had the same throughput of material, resources, and energy as we do, it would take 4 to 5 planet Earths.
Yeah.
Okay, and then we're already beyond the capacity of this Earth. We're going into significant deficits, ecological deficits. And this year, we're at 397 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere, and we're going to break 400 before the end, and that's CO2, before the end of 2013. There's 90 million tons per day of externalities of carbon gases going up into the atmosphere. I just read an article about water stress in Africa and water stress and climate change in Africa, and that within a decade or so there will be 250 more Africans under more serious water stress due to climate change. 64 basins, including the African Great Lakes, and that's only one example around the world. And so we have a lot of ambiguities here that I see that are in tension. And I know if you're an adult, you should be able to handle ambiguities, but we also have contradictions happening. And that's what I just wanted to bring that to light, because I don't know if it'll be fair enough to handle that if there's somebody in a session tomorrow or not. But to date, I think we've not handled the bigger picture and the full picture.
Okay, thanks. Now, somebody mentioned yesterday that we're using, 2.2 times what the actual sustainably productive capacity of the planet might be. And as we move from 7 billion to 9 billion people, and with 50% more food required, for example, let alone the energy requirement, the questions that you're raising
I'm
are...
concerned about major trauma in this century happening, and that we're going towards it like a blindfolded train.
Well, let's see if the panel wants to comment on that. Yes, they do. Okay.
Two comments on that.
Thank
You know, you can wake up in the morning and terrorize yourself with the catastrophes that's going to happen to the world at an accelerating speed. Or you can look at it and say, what can we do in a humble way, starting with yourself first, then your family, then your community, and then larger, and as a ripple, work your way out. and never get frustrated and never give up. Every civilization, family, and company faces tremendous adversity that at that time would say that's the end of us. But if there's one thing that gives me hope is that people are so inventive, so adaptive, good eventually triumphs over evil, that at conferences like this, by sharing ideas, you will find a way. But the risk in that is don't solve the world and let your backyard go to hell in a handbasket. I think the biggest and best strides are those people that clean up their knitting at home and by their individual actions and their individual efforts create some momentum that what they're doing actually fixes stuff. Whereas if you are continually reaching out to solve the world's problems, you'll be talking and you'll be talking and you'll be talking. And you will have not made some of the small improvements that you could have. So that's my philosophical approach to it, and that's where we endeavor to put our energy and get some traction. And it's not that we turn a blind eye to the rest of the world. We do reach out, we do help, we are trying to find technologies, but it's sort of taking a step at a time, and many steps lead to miles. But if you try to leap it all at once, you can't do it. So.
Helmi,
If I may, I'm in complete agreement with you that there's a lot that individuals can do and are doing, that there's a lot that communities and NGOs can do and are doing, but the world's problems also do need to be solved. And we've known about sustainability and the issues, all the micro issues that together become sustainability and the impact they'll have by the middle of this century. But guess what? We're still running in that same direction 50 years later. And we're all pointing fingers at each other. Government is saying business isn't doing it. Business is saying people aren't buying my green products. People are saying government needs to do this. There's a whole lot of this going on. And personally, as a sustainability professional who's really trying to push this in my company and really trying to invigorate our folks, we're doing the best that we can, but I don't think it's enough.
Need a good
I think a lot of other, but you know what? The crisis in sustainability is going to be when it's too late.
Yeah.
When you're going to a cliff, the crisis, when it happens, you're like, oh shit.
Yeah.
Now what do we do?
Yeah.
It's your greenhouse gases have gone past a tipping point. We're not able to grow food. Population is 7 billion, doubling every 55 years. We're trying to go to 14 billion and
No, we're not.
and 28. Well,
No, we're not. No, we're not. No, we're not.
it's growing in places where it shouldn't. And,
Yeah,
and what's
that's
happening
true.
is those people, there's just not going to be enough food. Population won't grow.
That's
It'll
right.
try to grow.
Yeah.
It won't grow, but in a very painful way because people will starve to death. That is not what we want. So while individuals are doing their part, and I think businesses are trying, there's a whole lot more that needs to be done to solve the world's problems. And I have a bit of a gripe against the people that should be solving the world's problems that I don't think have had enough progress to what I would like to see. So I know we're tight on time. So
Yeah, I
we'll
mean,
get to the
no, the
questions.
fact that we didn't finish the last trading round is just incalculably damaging, because we're still growing things where they shouldn't be grown. We're not allowing them to grow where they should be grown.
But this is such an interesting discussion. How do you, I think you sort of have to separate, there's the human being that does certain things because it's an animal and you're a human being. And then there's the other, that if we dreamed the dream and said that we could find a vehicle that had no emissions, if we could find the food that would be totally self-replenishment, if we could find the cure for all disease, what would that world look like?
Crowded.
It would be crowded, and people would travel to every pristine part of the world that today is not traveled to. We would be crowded and swamped, and we would probably accelerate up that curve so darn fast than to where we are today. And so I think that the solution here is not to say let's solve these what I'd call first order challenges, but how do we learn as a population globally that there's limits to growth, there's limits to things, because each onto his own will push to the max, to the detriment of the whole. And unless you have some world body to which we don't have that governs that, each will pursue to the detriment of the others its gain to get to the top of the curve. And so I think we have to be very careful what we argue for, that we want this no footprint, free-for-all, perfect world. I'm not sure I want that, because I think the outcome would be disastrous.
Do you want to add a word, Brian?
Oh, I don't know if I want to add
But
after
maybe-
all that, but I agree with a lot of Don's points. And the number I heard was 2.7 planets, right? That's the work of Vision 2050. And Vision 2050 is really about developing a plan for the world, and this is business taking a little leadership in the absence of government, and the CEO of the WBCSD talks about that. He's not saying it's perfect, we're just trying to make a difference. And Pepsi is a member of that organization, and the roadmap is trying to say, what are the things that we need to put in place in order that we don't fall off the cliff? Is it perfect? No, it's an attempt to try to have the dialogue, to begin the conversation, to make positive change in the world. There is no silver bullet when you look at this immense drawing, because they didn't try to do it in a report, they tried to do it in a collage, and it's a very powerful collage that each company that's a member can put into their thing and think about, how should I play in business and world to help drive that change to make it happen.
Well, what's the reference for our friend to read? How can he get access to that?
You can go to Vision 2050 on the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and it talks about all these things, and they're going back to relook at it this year to fine-tune it, and water wasn't a key thing in it, and now they're going to make water an even clearer lens in the whole thing because of the importance of it.
Thank you. Okay, we've got 2 questioners, so I'm just going to ask that you just give your question very briefly, and then both of you, and then 3 of you, however many of you are standing up. Thank you, thank you. And just, what are you pointing at, Bernadette? Yeah, okay, yes, okay. The 1 and the 2, and then we'll let the panel answer both of them. So put your questions on the table, please.
Okay, I knew this was going to happen, so I had to email myself the question. Okay.
Good man.
I also got an email from Zenith Bank in Nigeria, so.
Yes.
Okay.
How much would they like to give you?
My question, this is for Don Lowry. It's probably unfair, probably best answered by a federal official or an Albertan provincial official, but you said 85% of Alberta's waters are north of Edmonton, which I could believe, and I was wondering if the province of Alberta really knows how much water they have. And then the second part of that is, does that number include groundwater? That's all I wanted.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Okay, and we had another one over there?
Yes, Carl Yates, General Manager of Halifax Water, with the distinction of being the first regulated water, wastewater, and stormwater utility in Canada. So we fully, of course, buy into the cost causation principles of utility structures. My question is speaking directly to the water energy nexus, and I'm interested perhaps hearing from Brian and Don what methodology they use to put a metric on a reduction of leakage in the distribution piping within your either municipal units or your large industrial plants, because that's still one of the, it's no longer, I guess, a dirty secret in Canada now that a lot of our pipes have tremendous leakage. It's just dirty. And I'm interested in asking how you actually tackle that.
Okay, thanks. We've got 2 questions. Does Alberta know how much water they have? And secondly, how do you actually measure WUE and unaccounted for water? Okay.
So, thank you. I'm not sure, but I have probably a 90-degree measure of confidence because we draw most of our calculations on water in the either oil sands or water industry from the province of Alberta Department of Environment, Water and Natural Resources. And they have been doing an awful lot of very good work on water for life and measuring and taking strong positions up to and including having the first carbon tax in Canada for that. So I have a pretty good confidence that the knowledge is the water is flowing north as the curvature of the earth is there, but it is surface water. It is not calculating all of the aquifers, and it does make adjustment for the glacial melt and so forth. So it's a fairly, I think, comfortable statistic that it's 85%. Red Deer North, flowing north.
If you look at all the water in the world, do you know what percentage of it is in rivers? All the fresh water in the world, do you know what percentage is in rivers? Guess. 2.5% exactly.
Really?
So groundwater is not only the gorilla in the room, but I mean rivers, lakes are slightly more. Rivers are only 2.5% of all the globe's fresh water. And so the whole act is groundwater. So the question. Yeah.
And
frozen.
So after the glaciers, we've got the groundwater. Well, you got soil water, then groundwater, then.
Glaciers, groundwater, everything else.
Okay, right. Anyway, see, you didn't know you were coming to learn, get a lesson in hydro.
That's one of the 5, right?
Yeah, exactly. One of the 5 lessons from Bernadette. Okay, right. Right. Did you want to answer? Oh, you both had a question on how do you actually measure the water leakage?
The hero for this is Steve, because he's led our efforts to reduce leakage. And Steve, could you speak to the rest of Canada and what that statistic is, because it's quite illuminating.
Well, I think Don talked a little bit about it in his talk. So we've got a very active cast iron renewal program, and so a lot of that's driven kind of to continue to reduce water loss. And so Edmonton, we're very lucky because of the soil conditions that we have. So everything surfaces to the surface right away. I mean, we've got very low water loss, so well below kind of the 10% number that.
How do you measure it was the question.
Oh, well, so we got measured. We're measuring what's going out into the system.
And then to the meter.
We're 100% metered. And
so you just reconcile.
So we come up with a report every year that looks at all those factors. So for unaccounted for water in the system. But I think what Carl was talking a little bit. I mean, across Canada, that number is significant. In many cases up to 30 or 35%. And kind of interesting when you start talking about kind of some of the subsidies and things that happen is often you can get grant money to build a new water treatment plant.
Yeah, but not.
You can't get any money to fix your distribution system. So and that tends to if I'm only paying 30 cent dollars on a treatment plant, but I got to pay the full dollar to fix my system, that tends to drive some of those behaviors.
Do you want to talk about how you measure it?
Well, we just reconciliation of the meters, and we have some sophisticated models to kind of say where all the water is going, where we don't have it, but it's just metering and balancing those meters.
And what's a tragedy too is there's still so many places that don't even meter the water.
Yeah.
And in Canada, there's many large cities that don't have meters on it, and it goes to the argument of full cost.
Yep.
Full costing. You can't reconcile your water loss, at least if you're not metering.
And the world doesn't meter. Meters cost.
And the fact that we set these goals, and when Petro-Canada emerged, we had to go back and look at all the assets where we didn't have meters. We had to go put them in place so we could have clear accountability of how we're doing against those goals. So
I want to support what Steve said. When you look at the amount that it would cost to, most of us in this room know what the Millennium Development Goals were, the goal of reaching half the unserved population with safe and clean water. The cost of reaching that is only the cost of reaching that is X. The cost of maintaining that reach is 3X. So whatever it costs to reach all the people that don't have safe water, and this isn't even including the sanitation goal, fresh, clean, accessible water, the cost of keeping that going is 3 times X. Wow. And of course that's the money that is simply never there unless you've got a system that is literally sustainable. So, Helmi, do you have any words of wisdom you want to leave us with?
We talked about having visionary and aspirational goals. Certainly, our goals, our aspirations of leaving no trace or being net zero fuel us. But we would be nowhere if we hadn't set our BHAGs, our big, hairy, audacious goals, which are the metrics that I talked to you about. And they have driven, I think, over a period of time, a culture that's evolved from compliance to conservation, and now is starting to think about sustainability. This is a very complex field. We're learning a lot as we go. We have done a lot, but when I look at what needs to be accomplished, it is far greater than what we have done up to now. I've enjoyed the panel, and thank you everyone for your questions. If you have any other questions or any things to share, or any frustrations you want to share with me, and we can talk about the cliff. And
I got a soggy potato chip.
Soggy, okay. I'll send you a truck your way tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would echo what Helmi said. The value of the new vision, mission, and values, and those aspirational goals really drive those behavioral changes in the organization. And the importance of collaboration versus cooperation to drive change is very powerful. And I've been involved with Owsley since the get-go, and now with the incorporation of COSIA, you know, getting those kind of experts in the room can really be monumental in driving change and performance, and really looking forward to see that happen and the technology and innovation that's going to happen within the oil sands industry moving forward. So,
Word
I'll
of
say it
wisdom.
again. Water's not an entitlement, it's a hard-earned right. And I want to thank you, Margaret, and the organizers for putting an event like this together. I couldn't have imagined something like this 10 years ago, where we'd have the energy in the conversation and the excellent questions and the young people here that I get a sense that they're stepping up to this, and there's some excitement and I think hope that we are going to get better.